Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. People on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. Put your questions in the chat and I'll monitor that and ask the speaker. If you're in the room with a cell phone, if you could silence it, it'll be greatly appreciated. Here we go again with double, hold on one second. I'm going to change this.
All right. Have we begun? I guess we have.
Hold on one second, Richard. Let me just change something.
What?
I'm changing the closed captions. We had something going on there. Hold on one sec. Let me go back.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay.
Leave
Sometimes it goes double. I don't know why it goes double, but I don't like it when it goes double. It looks confusing to me. Okay, and Richard McMaster is here. He's going to talk about the power of the purse. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you. One of the strangest items in the Declaration of Independence, at least I used to think so, was the charge that the king had imposed the African slave trade on the American colonies and then refused to allow them to abolish it. Because, as we know, when our Constitution was adopted, one of the provisions in the Constitution was that nothing could be done to interrupt the African slave trade until 1808, or 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution. I learned better in time, and I think that this experience epitomizes the issues that involved what we're calling here the power of the purse. In 1767, the House of Burgesses in Virginia passed a bill that would impose a 15% tariff based on the purchase price on any slave brought into the colony. It immediately provoked a reaction from merchants in Liverpool and Bristol, which were the great British slaving ports, and they appealed to the Board of Trade and Plantations to overrule that act. Virginia tried again in 1769 with the same result, except that now the Board of Trade and Plantations instructed the royal governor to veto any law that affected the slave trade in any way. The House of Burgesses came back again in 1772, imposing a 25% tariff now. And once again, the law was overruled. And then 2 years later, when they were adopting, as we'll see, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but temporarily. But in 1774, when they were adopting resolutions, primarily for non-importation, but they included other things. The Fairfax resolves from Fairfax County, Virginia, which were written by George Mason of Gunston Hall for a meeting presided over by George Washington, had a resolution that we opposed the importation of any slave into the colonies, And Mason took the opportunity to denounce the slave trade as cruel and inhuman and to look for its total abolition. So this is the background to this particular case. And as you can see, it involves already a continuing dispute between London, Westminster, and the colonies about who had the power to do what. Now, every colony by 1750 had imposed on it a royal governor appointed by the crown. They had also they had in every colony a two-house legislature where the lower house, which had different names, was it the Assembly or the House of Burgesses or whatever, and the upper house, which was an appointed council. And they paralleled the British Parliament, so that the council was in fact the House of Lords. And nobody was elected to the House of Lords. And in this case, nobody was elected to the governor's council. They were appointed. And on the other hand, the lower house was always elected by the people in every colony. So in the course of the 18th century, the British Parliament had succeeded essentially the House of Commons in limiting the power of the executive, that is the monarchy, the crown, and also very much limited the power of the House of Lords, so that they were almost only in an advisory position. They had to pass on a law, but they really couldn't do very much to block it. So from the colonial point of view, the lower house should have all the same powers as the House of Commons in Britain. And through the 18th century, they had pretty well achieved this, so that they were able to limit the power of the governor. The governor had the right to veto any law passed by the legislature, but they found ways to get around that, as we'll see. And similarly, they had trimmed the council's power so that they were, or at least the lower house considered them to be no more than an advisory body. They couldn't initiate any law. That was almost universal in the colonies. So we're set up, as we saw in Virginia, for a test between essentially the lower house of the assembly and the appointed royal officials and the government at home. So I was going to read, this is going to be awkward because I need three hands, but I've only got two. You could just hold that for me. This is a statement from South Carolina in 1761. We, the only representatives of the inhabitants of the province, will never submit to any, uh, you know, uh, could you read that for me? Uh,
We, the only representatives of the inhabitants of this providence, will never submit to any in encroachment upon their sacred and most valuable rights. They have constituted us the sole judges and delegated to us alone the power of determining what taxes, assesses, or impositions they are able to bear. This fundamental and inherent right we can never suffer you to break in upon, nor permit any addition to be made to or indemnation from the manner of time we find expedient to fix upon.
Thank you. So, this is 1761, before there was any real rift between Britain and the colonies, but the South Carolina Assembly, which has now been successful in trimming the powers of the council and of the governor, is insisting that we are the only representatives of the inhabitants of South Carolina, and we alone have the right to determine what taxes will be imposed upon the people of our colony. So this is a statement that could be mirrored in almost any other colony, certainly by 1760, 1765. So let's go on to the next one, and I think we can probably skip the first one. Yeah, we've been looking at this problem of the Crown insisting that someone in the government in Britain should have the control of the laws that are passed, taxes and whatnot. And the position of the colonies, as stated by South Carolina and echoed by many other colonies at the time, is that no, you have absolutely no right. Everything belongs to the elected assembly, and they're loyal subjects of the crown at this point. They're not a revolutionary idea, it's simply their insistence on that. So now we're going to look at how this develops. Let's go to the next one. A quest for power. Yes, the lower house has certainly by the 1760s has established its power completely, and they think that they should not be interfered with. As Virginia said, if we want to limit the slave trade, we should be able to do so. And in that particular case, the response that was put forward by an inundation of petitions from Liverpool and Bristol and, and other slaving merchants was that the only reason Virginia wanted to do that was to increase the value of the slaves who were already there at the expense of the good British merchants and ratepayers who would be injured by this. So let's go to the next one then. Right. All right. How did they control these things? The very first one is all kinds of money bills. So the lower house, by this time, has been able to establish, just like the House of Commons, and it had been a long-standing position of in Britain, is that all money bills, any bill involving money, had to be originated in the lower house. So this was part of the way that they bypassed the governor and the council, that this is the right of all Englishmen, just as in Parliament only the House of Commons can initiate a money bill, so the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg is the only one that can initiate a money bill. And then the second one of these, the expenditures. Well, it was fine to say that only the Pennsylvania Assembly could appropriate the money for military purposes in the French and Indian War. But if it was left to the governor or to some other authority to decide how it would be spent, then the Pennsylvania Assembly really didn't have control over it. So they had gradually been able to get full control over expenditure. And this was a significant step forward because as in the case, say, of South Carolina, there were a lot of money bills, separate bills, I should call them appropriation bills, appropriations made for military purposes during the French and Indian War. And initially, that was left to Governor Littleton to determine how that money would be used. That if they had an appropriation to build a fort in Piedmont, upcountry South Carolina, near the Cherokee, then the money had to go for that. But, well, the governor could take some of that and use it for some other military purpose. So certainly by the 1760s, all of the colonies were able to say, yes, we not only have to originate a money bill or an appropriation, but we have to be able to control how it is spent. And then there's another separate and very interesting area called paper money. The first, I believe, of all of these colonial efforts, because there was a great shortage of hard cash in the colonies. And I remember this was from my boyhood, our county history, which was, my dad was a county historian, and the county history had an interesting story that, which apparently was true, that somewhere in the mid-17th century, someone walking along the road saw a shilling on the ground, and he immediately took it to Major Lawrence because he was the only person in the whole town who could conceivably have an actual piece of money. So it was, it was very hard to come by. So various efforts were made, and one of the earliest was Massachusetts, that had a land bank that, backed by the land, you could borrow money. They made paper money, and you could take that out. It's very much like a savings and loan, that you could, on the basis of the fact that you or your town owned the land, that the town or the individual could get a certain amount of money on that, but they had to pay it back. And that was disallowed almost immediately by the Crown. but it was tried in many different places. Pennsylvania did it, New York did it, and uh, Virginia did it. And by the 1760s, there was a great outcry in Britain against the colonies issuing paper money, because what invariably happened was that if this printed piece of paper said that the treasurer of the colony of Virginia would pay to the bearer £1, it very quickly depreciated, so that while it said £1, maybe it was only 10 shillings, maybe it was only 6 shillings, and it was going down, and so on. So the people who were most hurt by that, who did not want paper money circulating, were the merchants trading to the colonies, because, you know, you bought 50 pounds worth of goods, and then you wanted to pay me with what now is 20 pounds of, of provincial money. There was always a difference between sterling and provincial money. They're all separate. So things are toted up in sterling and also in Pennsylvania currency or New York currency, whatever it is. And so this was always being disallowed by the Board of Trade. However, it had the great advantage that it took a long time for that process to be complete. So maybe they had 2 years to circulate paper money, and then, yes, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done that, and we'll withdraw it. And in the 1760s, we had an interesting scandal in Virginia. The treasurer of Virginia at the time was a gentleman named John Robinson. And John Robinson, the treasurer, was supposed by the law, when you turned in the paper money because you had paid off your debt, he was supposed to burn it. It's no longer valid. We don't want it circulating. And he had the bright idea that he could loan it to favored friends who were mainly very large planters, and they could use it to pay for the things they were buying from Britain. So this was considered to be quite a shocking idea, and of course had a great deal of hostility from British merchants, but also from the colony itself, because Robinson had really been a corrupt official, and George Wythe, who was a famous jurist, cut his first legal case dealing with the mess that Robinson had left. So let's move on now to the next one. This is control over the civil list. Now, this contains mostly appointed officials. The governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the various justices of the courts were all appointed from Britain, and also the people who enforced the customs. So customs agents were also appointed from Britain. So how do you get control over these people? Well, based on the idea that only the lower house could appropriate money and that they would control the expenditure, they were able to say to Governor Dunmore of Virginia or Governor Colden of New York, yeah, we will only pay your salary if you play along with us. We have control over the money, so if you want to continue living in the style you're accustomed to, you have to do what the lower house wants. And also, they gradually, with a number of, it appears at different colonies at different times, they were able to chip away so that some judges were appointed by the lower house and so on. And that was very important because if you had a completely dependent on Westminster government, well, then it didn't matter much what the lower house did. But if the appointed people were all dependent on the lower house, well, then, of course, they had secured that power. And let's move on to the next one. Oh, that's a little further than I wanted to go. There were a number of other ways in which the different colonies had achieved a real control by the lower house by the end of the 1760s. But as we saw with Virginia, they still had the crown represented by the Board of Trade, which could disallow anything that they did. And so they were then going to be faced in 1766 with the Declaratory Act, which is after the Stamp Act crisis. Parliament passed a law that said that only the British Parliament can impose taxes and tariffs on the colonies. It's interesting that there had been for a long time a very similar law, again, a declaratory act that applied to Ireland. Ireland had its own independent parliament until 1800, but they could not do anything that would not jibe with what the House of Commons wanted in London. And so they were bringing the American colonies into line with that kind of policy. Again, they were not thinking that, oh, this is going to mean we'll lose the colonies, they're on their way to independence, but it came to be one of the steps that led to that. So, I don't know, I planned to do anything more than that. I think I was going to stop at that point and hear from you. Could you just run that just in case I missed something? Yeah, just run them down. Yeah, definitely. This is a period when, well, let me embroider a little bit on that. Why those dates? 1764, as we saw last time, the proclamation of 1763 dealt with a very different kind of British North America and the West Indies, that now the British control, the empire, extended to the Mississippi, and it extended north to Hudson's Bay. So in that vast territory, which included people, Indians, indigenous people, and French Canadians who had lived there and had property and so on, that it seemed good to the people in London that perhaps we need to tighten up and get more controls, more centralized controls. So just as they wanted to limit the old colonies to the really to the eastern divide, the heads of all the rivers that flow into the Atlantic, and everything else was an Indian territory or Quebec, a very large Quebec, which is uh, much of the mainland Canada at that point. They had also acquired the Floridas and a whole series of French islands in the West Indies. So they were thinking, the old ways of doing this don't work. Let's centralize much more. And so we had such things as there would be only one Indian agent, only one person authorized to deal with the Indians, he and his deputy. And there would be a tightening up of customs regulations. And British rule would British rules at home would be applied to the colonies. So that was a very significant change in those 2 years, especially. And then 1766 is the Declaratory Act that basically says the House of Commons, not your legislature, is the last resort for everything. So that's I think that's the end, isn't it? Oh no. Okay. Well, this this is just a summation that Parliament and the Crown, acting through the Privy Council or the Board of Trade and Plantations, would be uh, authorized to and had been authorized to oversee and overrule local legislation. But the various colonies, as we saw from that early statement from South Carolina, had decided that no, we are autonomous and not independent, but autonomous, and you should leave us alone. So we're through this, and that's our rights as Englishmen. So we are moving into a period there from 1767 to 1773 when the empire will begin to move toward dissolution. So I think it's time to turn the mic over. Okay? Comments, questions, threats? Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So thank you all. And I wanted to announce that in the fall, we're going to do what really is the next stage of this, which is to other people to break the monotony of listening to me. All right.
Yeah, let's take questions now for Richard. Okay, hold on.
Just a comment. The book, The Quartet, is an interesting complement to what you have been saying about the leading up to the Declaration of Independence, and that the states at that time were seeing themselves as independent states, not a United States,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and how that evolved over time. So it turned out to be the United States, but and but that was it's very complimentary to the kinds of things you've been saying here from things that frankly I did not learn when I was in school.
Yes, for a long time, even the United States took a plural verb.
Um, I wanted to ask about, I've forgotten the year that you mentioned, but at the beginning when you said the Virginia House of Burgesses had enacted a 15% tariff on slaves.
Yep.
And I think you mentioned maybe that wasn't the first time they'd tried that, but in any event, what were the reasons given by those Virginia legislators who introduced that legislation? What were the reasons they stated for wanting that 15% tariff?
Well, the British merchants were on to what may have been the principal reason, which was that if you kept introducing more and more slaves, then the value of my slaves would not be going up. It might well be going down. And they argued that the whole purpose of the bill was to increase the value of the slaves already in Virginia. On the other hand, the members of the House of Burgesses arguing for the bill pointed to two things. They didn't really say, oh, we really want to do this because I have 75 slaves on my plantation and I'd like them to be at least the value they are now. They really didn't want to say that. So they had two other very valid reasons. One was that the importation of Africans was possibly a greater danger than the domesticated people who had been living here. They had been on our property here for a long time, and I'm going to come back to make a comment on that. And so it's a matter of safety, and the other one was because it's hard to not to recognize that the slave trade was a very cruel and inhuman traffic. So a great many people who were themselves slave owners would say, we can't do anything about John's grandfather who was snatched from the West Africa, but let's not break up more families and submit people to the horrors of the Middle Passage and so on. And they were sincere in that, I believe. There's George Mason of Gunston Hall, to give him his full title, George Mason, when the Constitution was adopted, and they did nothing. This is to say what the mindset of these people were. Yes, I'm a slaveholder. No, I want the slave trade abolished. Was Mason said that the Constitution, people who wrote the Constitution, and he was one of them, but he walked out rather than sign. The Constitution provides for the security of the African slave trade for the next 20 years. No law can be passed against it. And at the same time, it did nothing to guarantee the property rights of people who already owned slaves and had them in their farms or plantations or homes or whatever. So Mason said, they have done that thing which they ought not to have done, and they have left undone that which they should have done. So you could be a slave owner and say, no, we want the slave trade abolished. So anyway, that's a good question, good question.
Thank you.
Let's,
Is there any other questions? Any other
Well,
questions for Richard?
did I stifle you? Oh, come on.
Okay.
I liked your story about the shilling had to belong to Major, whatever his name was. But I'm wondering back then, I know Mary's father here found a coin years ago from 17 something, and it was Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess back in those days, lots of lots of coinage besides British coinage was widely used, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, they were all valued. In other words, if whatever the Spanish doubloon said on it, if it had a value, it had a value that was set also by the British colony. But they circulate, all kinds of coins circulated, and they did so because of the great shortage. There were no coins minted in North America until sometime in the 1790s. I think there's a famous coin that I think there's only one of them that minted for that, and so it was difficult to find ways to pay for things. In Virginia, they also used, which did have a fluctuating but separate but steady value or discernible value, was you could buy things with tobacco notes. And that meant that you had brought your crop to a government warehouse. The government warehouse had priced it. They were holding it for you. They didn't buy it. They were holding it for you, but they then gave you certificates that said, you have 1,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds of first class tobacco. So you could use that at the store, and that would be accepted because that meant that the 10,000 pounds or whatever it was now belonged to the merchant. So he was the one who would ship it and send it back to Britain to go then to usually to the continental market. So, well,
Paul, do you have a question? You're online. You have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, so can.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. This has been fascinating because so much of what was going on in the colonies you see extending into the arguments that even come up to right now about representation in Congress and or in the local colonies. I was wondering whether you referenced the West Indies, whether any of these issues also were being argued out in the colonies in the West Indies, of which there were a number of British ones, and they were French for a while, but came back to become British, etc. But I wondered what the comparison, if there was one, whether there was more uh, kind of proposals being made for colonial legislatures in that region. I know that they turned to Barbados was actually the more or less the capital of the West Indies for many, many issues. And I think that they were also looked from the United States or from here, looked to Barbados for leadership in this part of the world.
yes, yes, exactly. Um, a slight reminiscence. I had a seminar with Jack Green at Johns Hopkins many years ago, and he was then looking into the fact that the British colonies did not stop at the ocean or the Gulf of whatever we call it now, and that it extended down into the West Indies.
Right, yeah.
Yes, so yes, there were moves by the lower house in, if I remember correctly, in Barbados and Jamaica and Antigua, that they wanted more direct power
Yeah, yeah.
and more authority over. So there were some strong parallels, and so you're absolutely right.
George Washington, the only time he ever went out of the country was to Barbados to be with a cousin who had some official role in Barbados government.
Oh, yes.
And there were so many connections between that region and here that even scholars today tend to ignore some of the comparisons in the way slavery worked its way out, and also when slavery ended in the 1830s, they had another way of doing sort of faux reconstruction. So there were a lot of things that were interconnected between the two regions that we still might learn some things from. Also, the one final comment, as I recall, that McLean at Duke, when she wrote the book Democracy, opened with if I'm not mistaken, with Pinckney from South Carolina telling the Constitutional Congress that the only way to get equity between the North and the South in the United States, because of the population difference, was through wealth. And they had to use some measure of wealth, which I think is still being used today with respect to gerrymandering and other kinds of devices that have been used to make sure that the wealthy retain their power. And that was certainly what was at stake. All from the West Indies is also in the new country, the new United States. When they were debating how they balanced out population differences, where they became important and how much power a state had or a colony had in negotiating as a multi-colony or multi-former colony establishments.
Good.
Okay, any other questions? Let's check online. No, nobody online. Okay, well, thank you, Richard. That was great.
And thank you all.
Yes,
Good to see you all.
yes.